Thank you, Kristin, for that beautiful song. I believe that music is a form of prayer, and how appropriate it is to start this event with musical prayer. Thank you all for coming, and we're glad you've been able to join us despite the inclement weather. The roads are clear now, thank God. Your presence here means so much to us. My name is Dianne Powell, and I'm one of 5 who make up Catholic Identity Committee here at the Woods. And this is our committee's very first event. Thank you. Our group was formed in late 2017 as one of the subcommittees working to implement the Aspire Higher strategic plan. We are small but mighty, and with representation from students, faculty, staff, and Sisters of Providence. I would like to acknowledge the members of the committee. When I call your name, please stand. Dr. Richard Collins, Associate Professor of Theology. Dr. and Sister Ellen Cunningham, Professor Emerita. She's back there, greeting you at the door. Joshua Winters, our campus minister. Josh. And Kristin Foster, whom you've met just a few minutes ago. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our college leadership who gives vital support to our work, our committee's work, living out our institution's identity. President King, Dr. Clark, Karen Dyer. Am I missing anybody? And all of you who are here today, again, thank you for supporting our work. And speaking of support, please join me in a heartfelt thank you to Jim and Sharon Hellman, whose love and support of the college made this event possible. And please feel free to take food if you haven't done so, or if you have to leave early, feel free to take some to go. Help us. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. You may already know him because he presided over our opening liturgy at the beginning of this academic year. So exciting to have you back at Providence Country. I believe he's also growing in fame for delivering thought-provoking and inspiring homilies at which he often shares childhood stories at the 2 churches that he pastors, St. Margaret Mary and St. Patrick parishes here in Terre Haute. But I'm sure there are many things we still don't know about Father Dan Bedel, one of which is he's a graduate of Marian University. Another is his previous experience speaking on Pope Francis's second encyclical Laudato Si on care for a common home. Born and raised in the German Catholic town of Enochsburg, Indiana, Father Dan grew up in the Catholic faith and discerned his vocation to priesthood at a young age. He holds a master's degree in divinity from St. Meinrad School of Theology and a bachelor's degree in theology from the Pontifical University of San Anselmo in Rome, Italy. He has been a priest for 4 years and enjoys country music, Lord of the Rings, and Notre Dame football. And I believe Star Wars is missing on this list, so I'm going to add it. Please welcome Father Dan.
Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Do I need a mic?
No, please
Good,
use
good.
the mic.
All right. You want the mic? All right, I'll do the mic. All right. Take that off the hook. All right. Glad to be here today, and thanks again to Kristin for the wonderful song at the beginning. There's an old saying by St. Augustine that singing is praying twice, but I have a brother-in-law who says he'd rather pray twice. He hates singing. I also want to recognize that this is a pretty good Catholic crew here, because as I watched you file in, you definitely filled in the back areas first and then made your way to the front. Good Catholics do that, so that's a good sign. It is a blessing to be here with you guys today, and we're going to talk about Pope Francis's writings. I do have to kind of give a quick caveat to that, though. in rereading a lot of his writings and encyclicals and exhortations, he covers a lot. And I was very convinced that I could have spent this entire talk talking about just one chapter of one of his documents. I mean, it's very rich. He covers a lot of different aspects. So in no way am I proposing that this talk takes the place of actually reading those texts. I highly encourage you on your own time. And they're not that long. I mean, most of them are fairly short, but he does a very good job of every sentence having something profound to say. And so what I've tried to do with this talk is to focus on themes that we can see in Pope Francis's writings, things that carry over from one document to the next, and it is kind of neat, and you can see this most authors of books, that there are words or phrases that even subconsciously they'll use and reuse again and again because it's important to them. It's something that they definitely want to convey in this message, and they find that just one book or one document isn't enough. They need to go back again and again, reminding us of these deep truths. And so we're going to look at some of these themes that Pope Francis touches on, and through this I'm hoping to cover the broad spectrum of social justice in the Catholic Church, so the different ideologies that we hold, but also to try to bring, especially at the end, to our own individual lives. Because I think a lot of times we read these documents and we get the sense that they're written for governments and major institutions and these large bodies of the world rather than for each and every one of us. And it can get lost in that. We can get lost in that, thinking, well, this idea about the environment or social justice or the poor, that's something for economists to find out. This is something for governments to work out. I don't have a whole lot to do with that. And I'd like to start broad and work down to kind of narrow points. I am very big on answering questions as I go along. I know we're going to try to reserve time at the end to answer questions as well. But feel free, if while I'm talking there's something that comes up or you want to know more about it, raise your hand. This is kind of a classroom setting in that sense. We are at a college. Raise your hand and we'll see if we can get your question answered. And tangents are fine. I work well with tangents, but I do have a list of things I do want to try to get through today. All right, so to begin with, I'm going to pull out the red marker. Maybe. And one of the things that Pope Francis does in his writings, and I'm really focusing on like Evangelium Gaudium, Amoris Laetitia, Laudato Si. These are the big three that he wrote. He also did Lumen Fidei at the beginning of his time, but that was more written by Pope Benedict, and then Pope Francis kind of came in and polished it up and released it as an encyclical. So I'm not going to touch that one as much. And then there were a few other documents that have come out that weren't as big, but still deal with this. Sorry? Oh, that was someone's phone, wasn't it? Shame on you. Shame. Okay, so to begin with, in all these documents that Pope Francis is writing in, he usually begins with kind of a synopsis of what he wants to speak on. He references the Gospels, he kind of brings scripture into it, but he always, in every document, and most popes do this in their encyclicals, he comes up with a list of grievances almost. He comes up with a list of things that are wrong in the world. Okay, and depending on the document, he veers one way or another in this list. But I'm going to highlight some of the biggest ones that make repeat appearances throughout his writings. And there are four major ones on the world scale that I want to touch on. So the very first one, and I'm going to title these "The Problems of Modernity." So we're going to stop. That's not red. That's pink. This thing lied to me. It needs to go to confession. So let's get a different one. Let's go with black. Black's a good color. I like black. I wear black all the time. There we go. Okay, modernity. So these are the problems that deal with modernity. The very first one is one that we see all the time. This is why I don't watch the news as much anymore. It's because the world is filled with a lot of hatred and violence. There is a lot of racism. There is a lot of discrimination. There are a lot of terrible, horrible things that people do to one another. And this question comes up all the time, and I don't have an answer to it. Is the world more violent now than it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago? Or do we just cover it better because of the way the internet works and media and what's available to us? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I do know that the world has always been this way. I mean, even when Christ speaks about it in his scriptures and in the writings that he has, it's very clear that from the very beginning of time, I mean, Cain and Abel, we had this going on. And so that's one of the big things that Pope Francis really puts out there, is this idea of hate and violence. And again, I could spend almost an entire lecture just talking about this subject. Like he goes into depth on this, read the documents, but I think this is kind of, just kind of good to highlight. This is one of the big issues that he touches upon, is the hate, the violence, the racism, the discrimination that we see in the world today. And just recently in Pittsburgh, we saw this with the shooting of the synagogue. That was a big thing that just took place a couple weeks ago. And it's being charged as a hate crime, but it's still, this violent action against a people, that have faced violence throughout their history. And it just is an ongoing thing. It's something that Pope Francis is very aware of and he wants to address. One of the other things that he touches upon again and again, and it takes different names, but I'm just going to highlight it as faceless, how did I highlight? Faceless systems. That's it. Faceless systems. Okay, so, and he categorizes this, governments are one of the things that he highlights with this, that there are a lot of times that governments are not doing their jobs, especially in third world countries and a lot of the tyrannies and dictatorships that we see around the world. But he also categorizes faceless systems as the economy. So even like unbridled capitalism is one of the things that he categorizes, I would categorize as a faceless system in his writings. But this could take many, many different forms. These are institutions or systems that are so big and so broad and so far-reaching that they don't have a face to them. They don't have a human element to them. And because of that, Pope Francis kind of calls them out and says, this is a concern for us because now we're having this moving part in society that impacts the entire world order that doesn't have this humanity to it. It's lacking something very Christian in that. And because of that, we have almost a sterility to it. Like it's something that's almost untouchable because of that. And we feel impacted by it because we don't feel like we have a voice with these systems. We feel like there's no way for us to correspond or to relate to them. And so Pope Francis, as the Pope, as this image, this symbol of peace and justice in the world on behalf of the Catholic Church, hopes that in his writings the faceless system is reading. He's hoping that the faceless system, whether it's governments or societal norms or kind of these large moving things, read this and recognize the error of their ways, that there is a problem inherent in the system, and it does not have a face that we can turn to. One of the other ones, and the next two I think are some of the bigger issues. Like these are big, and these are things that I think we're more aware of, like in the news and in the media outlets. The other two are not. These are two that do not get mentioned like at all in the news or in the media. These are very much under the radar. These are things that are under the surface, and many of us may even buy into them at some level and not even realize that we do. And so this kind of hits more on a personal scale. The first one is the idea of relativism. Does anyone know what relativism is? Just so I can, okay, a couple people? And I'm not going to call on you, so if you know what relativism is, I just need to know if you know it or not. Okay, so a few people. Okay, so relativism, and this is, you talk about repeat wording in Pope Francis's writings. Relativism is one of the ones that it is just prevalent. It's almost on every chapter of every page of his writings is this idea of relativism. What relativism is, and it's very prevalent in our culture today, because its intention is good. I want to start with that. The intention behind relativism is a very good one. The idea being that we want to be tolerant and accepting of other people's ideas and beliefs. And this is what the United States was built on. This is part of why we have our First Amendment rights, that we can honor and respect differences of opinion. And this is a good thing. This is how dialogue takes place. Like all this is very, very good stuff. And the Catholic Church is very much in favor of this. Where it gets to be tricky, and relativism speaks to this, is when we negate or say that objective truth no longer exists. So for instance, if in our faith, we say something to the effect of, well, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Roman Catholic, and we have other faiths out there, that means that we're all correct at the same time. Like all of us are 100% right? Logically, that can't be true. It just can't. Like I can't believe in the God of the Old Testament, and the New Testament, and the Roman Catholic God, and at the same time believe in the Hindu gods. Like the two do not logically coexist. Now, that's not to say that there's absolutely nothing true in Hinduism and we should just, get rid of the whole thing. Like that's not what it says either. There is truth there. But relativism, especially moral relativism, says that it's really up to you. You kind of get to decide what is true and what is false. It's a matter of opinion. There's no longer this objective truth. There's no longer this one thing that is true that we should all be seeking. And the way that we're designed, the way that we're brought into being, we are meant to find this objective truth. It's one of the things that brings us joy. How many of you guys enjoy going to class? That's what I thought. You should enjoy going to class. It should be something built into you because learning is joyful. Like finding new things is exciting. Now, a lot of times that learning takes place on a very human level. Like we learn something about our friends. We learn something about those that we're close to. We fall in love. That's a learning of its own accord. These things bring us great joy because we were meant to find truth. We were meant to find knowledge. What relativism does is it denies that. It says, no, there is no quest for truth. There is no star shining off in the distance that we're meant to reach out for. Instead, it's all just a matter of opinion, and we're never going to have any real dialogue because we're not seeking anything together. And so it denies a lot in relativism, and moral relativism especially, because that leads us to say that we make up the rules. That there is not a moral order out there that is good. Instead, it's just democracy. The majority of people. And we've seen how that works in a lot of places. I mean, relativism, moral relativism, is how we get things like the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, because there was a popular opinion. Germany was in this state where Hitler came to power and people were behind him, and he was teaching some very awful things. But because relativism, because we can just come up with our own truths and what's right and what's wrong, people followed him, and he did horrible things because of it. Now, I'm not saying that modern people that give in to relativism are Nazis. I'm not saying that at all. But it is an example of what and how dangerous this principle can be. And it leaves a lot to desire. So relativism is one thing that is plaguing our world, and we can't even really have true dialogue about what's good and moral and what's wrong anymore, because there's no context for that. The last one is individualism. And individualism, it is the idea that each one of us is responsible only for ourselves, and we look out for number one. And individualism in our society is rampant, a lot of it because of this consumer mentality. We live in a world where we are bombarded with advertisement, we are bombarded with ideas of means and things that we want to consume, whether it be food products, drink products, whether it be clothing, things that we want to buy. Individualism is the idea that I'm more important than anybody else. And so I need to look out for number one, even at the expense of other people. Now, a lot of times it doesn't come across that way. A lot of times it comes across as you have a right to these things. And we often word it that way. And especially in America, we're big on rights, human rights. And yes, there are human rights. You do have rights as an individual, and those should be respected. However, individualism gets to the point where relativism and individualism go hand in hand, where suddenly your opinion, even if it's completely wrong, has to be something that we can't even dialogue about, because you as an individual, you have a right to that opinion, and we can't even talk about maybe it's wrong. You have to accept that maybe it's right, and we just go with that, and it just denies so much in the way of dialogue and conversation. Also, individualism, it's big on, it's very intro focused, and it leads to a lot of problems. This is where a lot of depression comes from. This is where a lot of anxiety and worry and doubt come from in individualism, because we're so concerned with what's going on in our life and how we're impacted by things that everything in the world impacts us directly in that way, and we no longer have the means to look outside ourselves and to help those in need. And so individualism is the other big thing that Pope Francis hits upon that cuts us off from the rest of the world. So these are the big four things. Any questions about any of those before I soldier on? Okay, so we're good with relativism, the idea that there is no moral truth, there is no objective truth, that it's just up to everyone's individual opinion. And then individualism is the idea that we're looking out for number one, and we're really not concerned for anybody else. Those are key things to keep in mind. All right, so Pope Francis then in his writings, he tries to counter these things. And he does so in a very, very strong and powerful way. And again, I'm going to try to hit these themes to how he counters these big problems that he sees in the world. And again, these aren't the only problems. There are way more than this that he goes through. And you can pick anything and it would fit in the midst of this. So like the destruction of the family, that's a big one that he goes into quite often. That fits into individualism very much because every individual in the family thinks that they're somehow unique and special and they're not responsible for the rest of the family. And so you see this disintegration take place, especially around the family table. That's where it really takes place. Everyone has their own things they need to be doing. They have things at job or school or whatever it may be that they don't get together at the family table just to talk about what's going on in their lives. And when that doesn't happen, when individualism takes over in a family, well then suddenly you have no dialogue and suddenly you don't even know the other person and things just kind of fade away and suddenly you look around and you're like, I don't know these people. I don't know my mom or dad. I don't know my brothers or sisters. They're just annoying to me. I'm just frustrated by them. And so we just distance ourselves further with individualism. Same thing with friendship. If our friends are not constantly affirming us or filling us up or making our lives better, if at any point in time they rely on us to be there for them, to make sacrifice for them out of love, individualism would say, we just drop them. We just say, you know what, I can't handle this right now. You're on your own. And there's so much in the world that's wrong because of these things. And so, any of the problems that you can think of can fit usually in one of these categories that Pope Francis addresses. Now, the answer to modernity is, this is a small board. I'm going to keep it up. Kingdom of God. The kingdom of God. All right, so at the beginning, Dianne introduced me and she said that I was a fan of Lord of the Rings, which is absolutely true. Love Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings fans out there? Anybody? Thank you. Anybody? Yes. All right, that's what I'm talking about. Have you guys read The Silmarillion? Huh?
I'm like working on it.
Working on it. That's the right way to put it. You're working on The Silmarillion. There's another book that Tolkien wrote that has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings. It has nothing to do with The Silmarillion or this world that he created. It's an obscure book called Leaf by Niggle. Anybody read Leaf by Niggle? I didn't think so. Leaf by Niggle is a very, very short book. Very, very good. It's one of Tolkien's first writings. And in this book, he tells the story of a man. Do we have any artists in the crowd? Painters, sculptors? Okay, awesome. The story, there you go. Late, needed help from a friend. Okay, there you go. Not willing to admit yourself. In the story, it focuses on this young man who is an artist. And he wants to paint this leaf, and he wants to make it extremely detailed. He wants to get this thing right on every possible level. There's really no artistic value to it. He wants it to be almost a photograph when he paints this leaf. And he has the canvas for us, and he starts painting it. And the leaf is so perfect. It's just so wonderful and beautiful and glorious. He's like, well, I'm not going to just stop with the leaf. I want to keep going. So he paints a twig that attaches to the leaf. And he's like, well, that twig is just so good. I mean, it's just so perfect that he's like, I can't stop there. So he paints a branch that attaches to the twig, attaches to the leaf. And then that branch has other twigs and other leaves. And he's off the canvas at this point. He's painting on the wall of his house, and it goes up to the ceiling and down to the floor. And he's got the root system, and the bark on the tree. And, this whole 30 years he spends working on this tree, this massive tree, and all of its detail and complexity and beauty. And then he dies. And he goes on to the next life. And Tolkien, he's Catholic, but he's very vague on this. You can't tell if Niggle, who's the name of the artist, if he's in heaven, if he's in purgatory, if he's in hell. We don't know. He's just in the afterlife. And he's in this open field, and he looks out, and there in the center of the field is his tree. But it's real now. It has actually got the wind blowing through the leaves. They're moving in the wind. There are animals scampering up and down it. He can sit underneath the shade of this tree and feel the coolness and the sweet relief on his skin. He loves this tree. And he goes towards this tree and is mesmerized by what was not possible in this life, like what was not realized here, but hinted at. And there's an angel that shows up at this point in the story. And he stands next to Niggle, and they're both admiring this beautiful tree. And the angel just kind of turns to him and says, I think we can use this here. I love that story Because I think so often, and when we get talking about the spiritual life, we make a divide, and we say, okay, yes, there's the spiritual life, there's praying to God, there's a connection to God, and when we die, we hope that we make it to heaven. There's that half of things. And then there's the half in which we live here and now. And we're in the physical world, and we have our problems, but thankfully those things will end once we die and we go to heaven. And there will be no more war, no more violence, all that stuff will go away. And so what we do in this life, we just got to survive. You know, we just got to pray, we got to stay close to God, we have to make it through, muscle through the struggles of this life so that when we die, we can make it to heaven, and then everything in this life is forgotten, and it's the end of the story. No. That is chronically untrue, and Pope Francis tries to get at this. The kingdom of God starts now, in this world, with what we do. And the crazy thing is, the things that you do, even in the physical world, I believe have an impact on the life to come. C.S. Lewis, he talks about this in his writings, especially in the Chronicles of Narnia. At the very end, it's the, what's the name of the book? The Last Battle. The Last Battle. At the very end, you get a glimpse of what he thinks heaven looks like. It's a very physical reality. There are like multiple versions of England that are all right next to each other because everyone kind of has their own view of what England is and what the beauty of England is. And so there's all these multiple versions of England and multiple versions of these houses in England. And it's just this idea that things that happen in this life that have an impact on you and make you a better person may exist in the next life. Because now they've been infused with something good and beautiful and true, and those things do not die. They live on. We've been taught in Scripture that when the end of days come and the trumpet sounds, there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And that'll be a physical reality. It's not just going to be disembodied spirits who will rise from the dead, physical, corporal beings, and live in a physical universe. And so it's just so impossible to think that if you were a carpenter or a contractor and you build a beautiful, good house, and a poor family moves in there and they start a life together, a married couple, and they form a family. And those kids grew up in that house, and they have memories of that house. And they were raised there, and they learned what was good and beautiful and true in that house. Is it so impossible to think that house will exist at the end of days? Because it made an impact, because it's part of the kingdom of God, even here and now. And so for Pope Francis, the idea is that the kingdom of God is not something waiting for us, it is something here, and it deserves our attention. It deserves our passion and influence. It deserves our love. And so, in response to these 4 ills of modernity, which again I could spend hours talking about, but I'm not, because this to me is more exciting, obviously. The kingdom of God. So, he has 4 things that I'd like to, and these are the 4 base tenets of Catholic moral theology. So the first thing he hits on again and again and again is the dignity of the human person. Fall over if I keep doing this. All right, dignity of the human person. Now, with the dignity of the human person, we recognize then that every single individual is important. Important, special, unique, however you want to name it. And in that, they're created in the image and likeness of God. This is the basic Genesis teaching from the very beginning of time, that when God created us, he created us in his image and likeness. Now, when he did that, that means that everybody has value. Now, yes, this is Disney 101. You know, every Disney movie you watch, you know, you are special. Whoop-de-doo, you know. As my brother David used to say, if everyone's special, then nobody is. You know, it's kind of the whole Incredibles thing. You know, if everyone's a superhero, well, then no one's super, you know. And that's just not the reality. When God created us, every single bit of it was planned. He knew exactly who we were going to be, and we fit into this bigger piece. The other side of it is there will never, ever be another person like you ever in existence. Like, it's just scientifically, it's not possible. And so there's something just dramatic about that. Here's the other crazy thing. We often don't think this way. Jesus Christ came to earth to save humanity. We know this. The story is very clear. He goes up on a cross. He dies for our sins. Very beautiful story. Very true story. But did you know that if only one person had sinned out of the human race, let's just say the rest of the human race was sinless. From Adam onward, the story was different. They didn't fall in the paradise. They didn't eat of the tree of good and evil. And that we lived in paradise. But then thousands of years after Adam and Eve, someone fell. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was me. Christ still would have come to earth. And he still would have died for that one person. And when he died on that cross, It wasn't this general, broad, sweeping thing in his mind where he's like, I know I'm dying for humanity. He went through every single name when he was on that cross. Your name went through his mind and through his heart when he hung upon that cross. That's the dignity of the human person that competes against the hate and the violence in the world today. This is our response. And how we play that out, the dignity of the human person, we play this out because we realize that each one of us are sinners and we do make mistakes. We recognize that we're in this together because each of us have dignity, but we've failed in that dignity. We have failed in that response. And so the response in the dignity of the human person that goes against the hate and the violence that we see in the world is mercy. That is the response. We cannot fight hate and violence with hate and violence. It doesn't work. We tried it for thousands of years. It doesn't work. When Jesus Christ came, he wanted to break the circle of violence. And so he did it by teaching us mercy. You turn the other cheek. You love your enemies as well as your neighbors. We hear that stuff and it goes in one ear and out the other because we don't think about the consequences of that. To love your enemy. Now you may think to yourself, I don't have any enemies. Yes, you do. You have people in your life that you cannot stand. And you know who they are. And we're meant to have mercy on them. I like to put it a different way. Instead of mercy, to think of it as pity. And that sounds weird because we don't use pity a lot anymore because pity seems that we're belittling the other person. If you pity somebody, you belittle them. That's not true. Pitying somebody, especially those who enact hate and violence, those lost souls that don't know any better and they're doing stupid, stupid things because they've been misled by whatever. They are pitiable. Christ, when he came amongst us, he looks upon the crowd with pity, we were taught. And he explains why. He looks on them with pity because they are like sheep without a shepherd. They are lost. And so our response of mercy and pity for those that we can't stand, those that cause hate and violence in the world, that's how we respond. Why? Because now we're recognizing the situation. These guys are the poor souls. These guys are the ones in need of our mercy and pity, in our love, because they are lost. They are the ones that are truly suffering. Yes, they enact suffering on others. Yes, it's horrible what we see, but they're the ones that are in most need of a loving Savior who thought of their names when he died on the cross. The next response is, again, so the next thing was the faceless systems that we talked about earlier. The response to that in the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is the idea of the common good. And these two balance each other out. If we have dignity of the human person, which again is established in the fact that we were created in the image and likeness of God, and we have the common good, which is the idea that any procedures, policies, institutions, governments, economies, all these things should be based around what is going to be for the greatest good of a people without denying the dignity of the human person. And that's a balancing act. It's a hard thing to come upon. But in the common good, we have this idea, and Pope Francis, this is I think one of my favorite things that Pope Francis came up with. It's not something new, but it is at the same time. He I think, invented a new virtue. And he uses it again and again in his writings. And it's hard to define, but I think it speaks to the common good. It speaks to how we respond to a faceless system. That virtue is tenderness. Now, I do not mean some like wussy, wimpy kind of virtue where we're just, lovey-dovey on everybody. That's not what I'm talking about. When he talks about tenderness, let me, when I was a kid, they mentioned that I tell kid stories all the time. When I was a kid, I was horrible at spelling. Anybody here is horrible at spelling? Have I misspelled anything yet? I think I'm good, but I am a horrible speller. And I remember I was in the 3rd grade, and I went to school, we had a spelling test, and I failed. And I was an okay student, and when I failed, I thought my parents were just going to be livid with me. So I had an hour-long bus ride after school. We were the first ones on the bus in the morning, last ones off in the evening. Hour-long bus ride coming home from school, and I have this big red F on my spelling test. I'm thinking to myself, this entire hour, how am I going to get rid of this test so that mom and dad never find out about it and I don't get in trouble for doing this? So here I am, figuring, and I'm thinking to myself, if I put it in my backpack, they're gonna find it, because Mom always goes through my entire backpack. If I put it in my pockets, they're gonna find it, so that's not gonna work. I thought about eating it, because I think that would have done the trick. Like, I don't think it would have come out the other end whole, so I think we would have been fine. But even then, I was just like, I don't like the taste of paper, and it's got all this ink on it, like, that's probably not the best idea. So my grand plan, as I started panicking as the bus came up to our house, was I took it and I just crumpled it up as fast as I could. And when I got off the bus, there's a woods right across the street from my house. There's not another neighborhood or a house. It was just this giant forest. And I just tossed it into the woods. And then I ran across the street, down the lane to our house. And I remember tossing it in the woods. And the bus driver saw me. He was just like, "Hey, you dropped something." I was like, "No, I didn't." And I just kept running back. Went in the house, watched my cartoons like I always did. And just waited to see what was going to happen. And I happened to look out the window when Dad was coming home from work. And he pulled in the driveway, and then he stopped, which he never does. And he got out of the car, and he walked across the street, and he picked up a piece of paper from the woods. He thought it was just trash. He hated there being litter on his yard or on his property. So he went over, picked it up, and I saw this from the window. Like, this is like 100 yards away, is the lane. And so I'm watching him, and he just slowly unwrinkles it, and he kind of turns up, and I swear he looked right at me in the upstairs window, looking out at him. I closed the curtains. I was like, what am I gonna do, And so Dad came in, and he yelled up the stairs, and he was like, "Dan, can you come down for a second? We need to talk." Which you never want to hear from your dad. So I come downstairs, and he pulls Mom in as well. And I'll never forget, I don't know why this took place. We went into, we have this itty-bitty bathroom in our house. We only have one bathroom in the entire house, and there's 7 of us living in the house. We go in there, and he, I don't know why we did it in the bathroom. He closed the doors, and he sat me down on the commode, closed commode. And they stood around me, and they showed me the piece of paper. And my dad was like, "What is this?" And I was like, "Well, I failed, and I didn't know how you would take it." And my dad, he looked at me, he said, "Son, we love you. And when we show that love, we want you to know that you can tell us anything. We want you to know that we're on your side. We are here for you. Yes, we're a little disappointed by this. We're way more disappointed that you hid it from us." That's tenderness. It goes beyond mercy. It's not just mercy. It is a desire for there to be change taking place. It is a desire that we love as God loves. It's a very unique and a very human thing. I imagine when Christ looked at people, it was a tender look. And it's hard to, if you've never experienced that, if you've never experienced tender love from a parent or from a friend or from a loved one, you're missing out. Because it is a very, very unique thing. Now, he takes this virtue of tenderness, which again, it's hard to encapsulate. It's charity, it's love, it's mercy, it's forgiveness, it is courage, it's vulnerability. It's all these things wrapped up into one, and it's very familial. You almost always find it in families. That tenderness lends itself to the common good because suddenly, not only do we see the dignity of the other person, but we recognize that they are worthy of our tenderness, and that anything that we do on any level of society should be tender. The government should do things with tenderness in mind. Companies should do things with tenderness in mind. Economy should operate on the level of tenderness. That is a human quality. It is a virtue instilled in us by God. This is where Pope Francis, and he picked the name Francis for this very reason, this is where he goes into the poor and poverty and how we are so horrible about dealing with this issue. We just relegate the poor to the sidelines. We just kind of forget about them. We show this ignorance about it. And his point is we can't do that anymore. Great story. It was about this, it was about this time of year, a couple years ago. Getting ready for Christmas, and me and my brothers were out doing some Christmas shopping, which we hated doing, but we figured if we did it together as guys, like it was more manly than just going shopping with like our sister or something. So we went out together, and we were very quick about it. We went into Walmart, picked up what we needed, because Walmart you can get about everything, so we just went in there. And we finished up, and there was a Dairy Queen right next to the Walmart back home in Greensburg. And we went into the Dairy Queen, got some lunch, we were just kind of hanging out, and David, my brother David, goes to the bathroom. Well, me and Anthony, my other brother, we're sitting there just talking and yapping, and we start looking, and we're like, where's David at? Like, he's taking forever, did he fall in? Like, what's going on, And so we look over, and he's standing at the counter of the Dairy Queen talking to this random stranger. We have no idea who this guy is. And we see David bring this guy our direction, and he comes to our table, and he's like, guys, this is Chris. And we're like, hey, Chris, how's it going? And David says, Chris doesn't have a place to stay. And he doesn't have a car, he has no money, and he needs to get to Batesville, which is about half an hour away from Greensburg. And he was just like, we're going to take him to Batesville. And it was David's day to drive, so it was his car, his rules, he was picking. Me and Anthony, though, looked at each other like, I think we could take him if we need to. Like if things get out of hand, like we're two, rough guys, like we could take Chris on if things get crazy. Unless he's got a gun, then we're screwed. We don't have any way to take care of it, or a knife. We had no clue. We're like, David, why? Why would you do this? So we're very resentful of David at this point. We walk out to the car and we get in, and David's driving us down the interstate, and it's like this kind of weather outside. Snowy, cold, but we're driving down the interstate, and this smell just starts to perforate the entire car. It's a little bitty car, a little 89 Honda Civic, this itty bitty hatchback vehicle. Chris had not showered in a very, very long time, nor had he brushed his teeth in a very, very long time. And he liked to talk, Chris did. And he liked to talk about conspiracies. He was convinced that Santa Claus was actually a vampire that came into people's homes to suck their blood. There was a whole thing about that. It was just crazy, talking about Christmas stuff. And so we had to roll down the windows at one point. It was so bad. And it was cold, and the wind was blowing in. And I remember sitting in the backseat of this car just being like, why? Why? Why are we doing this? We're supposed to go Christmas shopping. It was going to be a great day. And here we are, half an hour in the car with this bum. We get to Batesville, and we ask him where to drop him off. He says, well, I know someone at the church, so can you drop me off at St. Louis, the Catholic church there in town? And we're like, yeah, we know where that is. We go there quite often. We go over there, and we're getting ready to drop him off, and God bless my brother David. He looks back at me, and he was just like, Dan, do you have any change that you can give to Chris? And I was like, all I got is a $20 bill. He's like, well, okay, so I pull out my $20 bill, I give it to Chris, and I'm just thinking, man, this is awful. And here, I'm a seminarian at this point. Like, I'm training to be a priest, and I'm still, struggling with this. And I'll never forget it. Chris opened the door, and he's getting ready to go into the rectory at the church there to seek some help. And he turns around to us. And he's got this toothless smile, and he looks at us and he says, whatever you do to these least ones of mine, you do to me. I'm not saying that he was Jesus, but for a second there, I wondered. And it really put a lot of things in perspective for me. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that, but this is what we're talking about with tenderness. My brother David, that's what he was talking about. And with the poor, yes, we need to fix systems. We need the government to do things. We need the economy to do things. Yes, that is the thing. But we need to do things as well. We need to build up the common good in our society, and the poor are included in that. The next response that Pope Francis makes is to relativism. And he does this, I think, in a very interesting way. And I don't know if he did it on purpose or if it just kind of is the way his writings kind of played out. But he goes into what is kind of the next phase of Catholic moral teaching, social teaching, which is the idea of subsidiarity. Does anyone know what subsidiarity is? All right. See, you guys are learning so much today. Isn't this great? Subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the idea that most problems, most social conditions are best handled at the local level, like at a smaller, more compact level, because it's at that level that people feel like their voices can be heard, that we can have a great dialogue, we can have good discussion about things. Once things get too big, which of course in the United States, everything's way too big, federal government, all that kind of stuff, it loses a lot of its impact. Like, yes, we vote, we just had the elections here recently, but how many of us feel that our individual voice is actually heard in Washington? Anybody raise their hand? How many of you feel like your voice, like your representative is representing you personally when he goes to Washington? How many people feel that way? No matter how you voted. Exactly. It just doesn't work that way. Subsidiarity, it takes this and says, at some stage we need to focus on what happens at the local level, what's happening in Terre Haute, what's happening in our neighborhoods, what's happening in our colleges. What this does is it recognizes that, our culture here in Terre Haute may be different than the culture in Enochsburg or Greensburg where I was raised. It may be different than Indianapolis. And that's okay. That is good. But that's not relativism. Relativism would say that we can just do whatever the heck we want to do, and we're fine with that. What subsidiarity does is it says culture can be different. We can have different ways of approaching things. We can have different ways of governing ourselves, different ways of applying ourselves to the community, and yet we're still pursuing what is ultimately good. So in subsidiarity, and we have this idea of culture, we are seeking what is good, beautiful, and true. And these are objective things. These are things that have their basis in God himself. Hence, there is a perfect goodness and a perfect beauty and a perfect truth, and that has to do with God. And we are meant to find this out. Now, subsidiarity helps us to do that at a very local and culture-based level. Now, the thing about this, with the good, the beautiful, and the true, which refutes relativism, again, that there is none of these things, that these things do not exist. When we have this in place, suddenly things become way more clear. So, a few conversion stories. There was a professor at Boston College, Peter Kreeft. Anybody heard of Peter Kreeft? Great Catholic theologian. He had all these fellow academics that he was with, all these fellow teachers that were not believers. They were atheists in Boston College. But he still had a familiarity with them. He was still friends with them. It was something that he very much enjoyed, being with them and talking about different things. And for years, he tried to convince them of the morality and the beauty of the Catholic Church, and failed miserably. He used logic, he used philosophy, theology. He tried to approach them intellectually, academically, and it just fell short. They didn't care. They had their own opinion about things. They were big believers in relativism, that there was no objective truth, therefore there was no God. They went down the whole logical rabbit hole. With the good, the beautiful, and the true, it was amazing. So years later, and Peter Kreeft, saw all these professors leave and go on to various other universities, he would run into them from time to time. And there was one of them he ran into. It was some fundraiser or whatever he was at, and this other professor that he knew back in the day was there as well. And he started talking to him, and the guy was like, "You'll never believe it, Peter. I became Catholic." And Peter's like, "Really? After all this time of me arguing with you and having these academic discussions, like what could have possibly brought you to the Catholic faith?" And the man said, "Well, it's the funniest thing. Me and my wife, we got these tickets a couple years ago to go see the symphony. And we went to the symphony, and it was playing Bach, and some of his compositions. And it was just beautiful. And I remember sitting there in the symphony and listening to this wonderful, profound music and thinking to myself, there's no way that only a human being on his own could write this music. Bach had to be inspired by something, and it wasn't another human being. It had to be something divine. It was so beautiful that this guy was so moved by it that he's like, I have to start believing that there's something greater out there. There's something beyond just the human element of this world." And so he started exploring. He started exploring what is ultimate good, ultimate beauty, ultimate truth. And he finally came to realize there was a God, and he was a good God, and a beautiful God, and a true God. And he went through RCIA and became Catholic and very strong in the faith now. Now, here's the crazy thing. Peter Kreeft went to another event a couple months after that, ran into another one of his colleagues, and the colleague was like, "Peter, you'll never believe it. I became Catholic." Peter's like, "You don't say. Well, how did you come into the faith?" This person's like, "Well, you'll never believe it, but we got tickets to go see this concert by Bach. And we went and we listened to the music, and it was and then, believe it or not, and I still don't believe it, Peter Kreeft said this happened a third time. He ran into a third of his colleagues it was Bach. All three of them. It was Bach. So I'm convinced now, I'm just not going to give homilies anymore. I'm just going to play Bach from the podium. That's going to do the trick. But the idea being, with the good, the beautiful, and the true, if these are objective realities that we pursue, and especially within our culture, which you can have multiple different cultures, that's fine. That's a good thing. Diversity helps us to find these things. It's like a multifaceted diamond. If have you ever seen the Hope Diamond in DC, in the Smithsonian? Hope Diamond? Anybody? A few people? Beautiful. Giant rock. Very tempting to steal, obviously would be against one of the commandments. You look at that thing, the thing about that diamond, they don't put it up against the wall to display it, right? The Hope Diamond, massive diamond. You don't put it up against the wall and just see it from one perspective. That would diminish the value of that diamond. Where do they put it? Right in the center. And it's on this like little turntable thing right there in the center, so it's constantly moving around, lights all around it. Now, why do they do that? Well, it's obvious, because that way you can go around and see the lights shining through it from various angles, but it's still the same diamond. It's not a bunch of different diamonds, all of which have equal value. It's one diamond. But you can see it from many different perspectives. That's what subsidiarity does. That's what culture does for us. It helps us pursue this in many different ways, and they're very good and beautiful ways. And it's our job to seek those out and to help society to do the same. All right, the last response, so this is to individualism, and this is probably his biggest piece, is solidarity. And with solidarity, it kind of speaks for itself. Solidarity is the idea that we are in this together. We're a solidified unit. We were together. And this especially plays out in the role of the family. Because in the family, we learn to be part of this greater whole, right? And the idea is then from the family, we have communities. And then from those communities, we have the human family. We have the biggest family that we're a part of. And in this, and again, it may sound like this is repetitious, but they all play together. So the dignity of each human person, but then there's the common good. They offset each other. Subsidiarity, things can happen at the local level. But solidarity, the fact that that local level is still part of something bigger than itself. All these things line up together to counteract these evils that we see in the world today. And with solidarity, it's the idea that we're part of this with everybody else. We're in this together. We're on the same team. And when you talk about divisiveness, which happens a lot in our country nowadays, we lose out on this. I had a parishioner the other day. I couldn't believe they said this. I had a parishioner, and granted, the political climate that we're in, and the whole Kavanaugh thing, and the elections, and all this stuff going on, they came up to me, and they're like, "Father, I think our country's more divided now than it has ever been before." I was like, "Are you serious? Have you ever heard of the Civil War, where we literally fought against ourselves?" Like, this is not the most divided we've ever been. But it is bad. I mean, the dividedness of our country is bad. Solidarity says, no, we got to change the way we look at this. It's not Democrats versus Republicans or progressives versus conservatives. It's none of that stuff. We're on the same team. We want to see humanity thrive. We want to see the glory of man fully realized. That's the goal. Now, we have different ways of doing it. That's fine. But the first step is we've got to realize we're on the same team with this. We are together in this. And only when we begin to realize that can we have that dialogue. If we stick with relativism and individualism, that dialogue cannot happen. Because suddenly your opinion is just as valuable as my opinion in such a way that we can't even begin to have a discussion about it. There's no way for us to seek objective truth. But solidarity, if we're on the same team, then suddenly my opinion, your opinion, maybe we can figure something out. Maybe there's something that God can guide us to in this. And so the family becomes a big part of this. One of the things with the family, well, let's see, do I want to do that now? No, I don't. Do I? Yes, I do. No, I don't. No, sorry. I kept writing more and more notes, and so my handwriting got smaller and smaller. And I've got just this little thing that I'm really basing this off of. We'll skip it. I'm running low on time anyways. Okay, so individual solidarity. Any questions about these basic points that are made by Pope Francis to counteract these big systems? And again, these are the tenets of Catholic moral theology and social teaching: the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. You have those things in balance, you have utopia. Now, we'll probably never realize it in this life, but that's not the point. We're trying to build up the kingdom of God now so that it exists later. If that makes sense. Okay, anybody? Any questions? I must be the best teacher ever. No questions. That is awesome. All right, we good with this? Because I'm going to start erasing if we're good. We're good? Go ahead and erase it. Are you still writing?
No, I'm not taking notes. Is there one, I will take notes, if you have one reading that's online that you have a link for that incorporates all the themes?
So the dignity of the human person, common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. I'm trying to think if there's actually just a one textbook. So if you were to go to Pope Francis' writings, like, he doesn't use these themes. This is more the Catholic social teaching, and I applied it to Pope Francis' writings. There's the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching, I think is what it's called, the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. And it's from, I think, Ignatius Press. So if you were to look that up, like on Amazon, it's a thick old book. I mean, it's big. And I don't know how often they update it to like include some of Pope Francis' writings, but it's got stuff from like Paul VI and Leo XIII, and they're the ones that really kind of flesh all this out. And then Pope Francis is working on that framework, on that structure, the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. I think that's what it's called. So that would have it. Okay. Any other questions? Can I erase now? Good. Okay. Oh, we still got someone taking notes? Oh, got a question?
It's not a question, but do we have time for me to share an example of counteracting hate and violence?
Yes, and hold on to that, because I'm going to hopefully have some time for questions at the end. It's 3:34. How are we on time? How much time do I got left?
15,
So now
15
for
minutes?
later.
And then we'll have questions afterwards? Or is that including
That's
questions?
That includes
Late-
questions.
Okay, go ahead then. If that includes questions, go ahead.
Okay, well, this is from a book that's actually in this library called Rising Out of Hatred. And this young man, this is a true story, this young man is homeschooled, and his father is and mother are nationalists, white nationalists, supremacists, and their closest friend is David Duke of the KKK. So he's raised in this family and takes on this white supremacist ideology, even creates a radio show for kids. So then he goes away to college, and all of a sudden he's with people that he's had all these terrible feelings about, and he's interacting with them, and some of those people, including a person who's Jewish, a person who's Latino, and so forth, they befriend him. And at first they don't know who he is and what he believes, but later they find out, and some of them continue to befriend him. Not that they agree with what he believes, but they just befriend him as another human being. And over time, he starts like confused and struggling between what he believes and what he's learned in his family. And one young woman in particular, who's Caucasian, he befriends, they become good friends, and then she eventually starts challenging his thinking. And so in the end, he does change his mind about what he believes. And he's terrified to tell his family. So terrified that instead he ends up writing a letter to Southern Poverty Law Center, which fights against hate groups and violence and advocates against them. And so he writes this letter to them, and his father calls and says, Derek, he said, somebody hacked your email and wrote this letter. And he says, no, I wrote it. And then later his father says to him, why did you get out when we're just about to win? He said, because I need to warn people. But it was their friendship with him that changed him.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, and that speaks right to the dignity of the human person and kind of that friendship that develops on a personal level.
Yeah.
All right, so in the few minutes I have left remaining, so I covered the big stuff that Pope Francis talks about, but he also goes into what impacts us on an individual level. You know, what is right front and center to us in our daily lives, and especially, and he mentions this multiple times, for our young people, because I am convinced, I think he is as well, that our generation, my generation and yours, we have been, we face a lot. There's a lot going on in society that is against us. It does not support the fullness of the human being, and instead it breeds a lot of negative things. So these are some more things with modernity that we see in abundance, but this is more hitting us on an individual level rather than on a social or cultural level, if that makes any sense. So nihilism, or nihilism, depending on how you pronounce it, is this idea that you believe in nothing. That you're cynical, there's nothing worth believing in because it's just going to let you down anyways, right? So if you believe in God, he doesn't answer your prayers anyways. So it's a waste of your time to believe in God. You don't believe in our country or patriotism because it's all just a scam. You know, they're just going to manipulate you and take advantage of you. So don't join the military. Don't support our country because, you know, it's evil and it's doing all these horrible things. Don't believe in the family because it's something that weighs you down. Don't believe in marriage, because marriage is just something that is invented by man to, secure relationships, and it just makes it more difficult when you have to divorce and you have to get separated. Nihilism plays into that we don't believe in anything. And we think to ourselves, well, that gives us the idea behind nihilism, what makes it so prominent is that it's disguised as something very good. It usually disguises itself as freedom. And we fall for it a lot of times because we think to ourselves, well, if I don't join the military or give myself to my country, if I'm not a patriot, then I'm free to choose what I want in that. If I don't get married, I'm free in my relationships with other people. If I don't believe in God, I'm free to do whatever I want because I'm not bound by sin or guilt, horrible guilt, Catholic guilt. So it gets disguised as freedom, but it's not freedom. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. Nihilism, this idea of not believing in anything and being cynical and suspicious of everything around us, which is very much the modern age, it actually leads us to enslavement. It leads us to this position where suddenly we are the opposite of free because now we're just constantly untrustworthy of other things. And we go it alone. This feeds into individualism, which we talked about earlier. That's just us. And it's us versus the world. And we shouldn't believe in anything because it's just going to let us down anyways. The opposite of this, the opposite of nihilism, is an idea of faith. Faith. And faith gives us ultimate freedom because suddenly we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. We allow ourselves to believe in something beyond ourselves, whether it's our country, whether it's our religion, whether it's other people, whether it's our family, whether it's marriage, these institutions that are time-tested. These are things that have existed for thousands of years, and they've served humanity well. But in the modern age, we are very suspicious of them, and we've cast them aside. Faith calls us to something deeper. And Pope Francis, again and again in his writings, talks about how faith and making that leap of faith, it's the answer to so many of our ills that we face in today's society. But we're so leery of doing it. It's like we've just been trained that if you don't, if you don't grapple with things first and from an intellectual perspective, if you don't have suspicion and doubt at the outset, you're going to be deceived. You will be led astray. And that's just not true. We have to have faith in something. Now, what that leads us to at another level, it's not just faith, but at some level, and this is where a lot of problems come in, you have to commit to something. Because a lot of us, again, with that idea of freedom, we're afraid to commit because that limits our freedoms, or it seems so. If I commit to a faith, I have to choose. I have to choose something to believe in. If I commit myself to an ideal or to a philosophy, if I commit myself to another person for life, it seems like it's impinging upon our freedoms, but in fact, it's the opposite. It is something that allows us to enjoy life to the full because now we have, okay, here's the other thing with commitment and faith. Do you have, this is an honest question, and I want you to ask it of yourself. Is there something in your life that you would be willing to die for? Now, a lot of times we don't ask that question. We see movies about it all the time, people laying down their lives for causes they believe in. But do you have something that you would die for, or somebody that you would die for? Do you have an ideal? Do you have a belief that you would die for, you would give your life for? Because if you don't, you have nothing to live for. If you have nothing that you're willing to die for, you have nothing to live for. That is a truth. Because if you are willing to die for it, it's something that's worth living for. It's worth being with. That person, that idea, that God is now worthy. I can't answer that question for you, but I hope you ponder it. I hope you think about it and what you're willing to commit yourself in to the end, no matter what that end may be. There's something very freeing about that. I'm a big fan of war movies, I'll admit it. I love John Wayne. I love all the good old war movies. I love a lot of the modern ones. There is something, and I love when they do it in a film, and the actors do very well with it, when they know they're going to die. There's a battle, there's a situation, it's a no-win situation, and they know they're going to die. And you know what? Most of the time, if they have this, they're not afraid. The ones that know they're going to die and they're afraid is because they don't have this. They want this instead, and they want a way out. They want to keep living this boring zombie life. The ones that have committed themselves to something, and they know that there's a possibility they're going to die doing it, they die with peace. And they've come to terms with it. And there's something very, very beautiful about that. Not that I want any of you to die. Despair is another one that Pope Francis talks about being kind of this chronic plague on our society. Sadness, depression, you can name it in different ways. He comes at it with another virtue of joy. And he talks about this all the time in evangelizing from the gospel, Evangelium Gaudium. I mean, the very phrase means the joy of the gospel, the Latin phrase for it. And his idea of joy is that this is something that, it's not happiness. It's something different from happiness. And this is something that we struggle with. Oh, I'm running out of time. But we struggle with this all the time, that we pursue happiness. We've been taught to pursue happiness, but that's not the goal. That's strange for us to think, that happiness is not the goal, but it's not. The goal is God himself, because in that we find joy. It's something beyond happiness. The irony is, if you pursue happiness, you're never going to find it. You'll always compare yourself to people who you think are happy, and they usually aren't either. If you pursue happiness, then you're going to constantly ask that question, am I happy? And the answer is going to be, well, I don't know. Am I? I don't know. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I need to do something different. And then we're constantly, the grass is greener on the other side mentality, and that never works. We keep changing things, thinking that's going to make the difference. Change my diet, that's going to make me feel better. Change my routine, change the friends I hang out with. Can't change your family. The irony is, if you pursue God above everything else, even in spite of happiness, even if you give up happiness to pursue God, guess what? You'll find happiness. It's just, I don't know, it kills me. It's one of the most, it's not obvious. That's the crazy thing. It's not obvious, but it's true. If you pursue happiness, you'll never find it. If you pursue God, you'll find happiness. It's a paradox. I can't explain it. I don't know why it works that way, but it does. Maybe it's the way God designed us. So joy, and this is the best way to evangelize. Have you ever been convinced of something by an unhappy person? When they have commercials and they're trying to sell, sports drinks or whatever, do you think they have depressed people? Like, you should try this Gatorade, it's okay, it's fine, I guess. No, they're joyful, they're happy, they're enjoying whatever it is they're trying to sell you. The same is true of the gospel message, hence Evangelia Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And this is how you convince people. When I was at St. Minor, we took a trip over to Europe for a little bit, and we were in London and Paris, and we went to Rome, and we went to Einsiedeln, Switzerland. When we were in Einsiedeln, there was a monk there that I loved. He spoke German, and only German. I had no clue what he was saying anytime. I don't know any German. But every time we celebrated the Mass, or anytime you just see him walking down the hallway, he had this smirk on his face. And it was kind of the smirk that you see, like, he was the monk I'm convinced that would put whoopee cushions underneath the other monks, when they went to chapel. Like, I'm convinced that's that kind of guy. I don't know why he was smiling, but he seemed to have this inside joke that I wanted to be in on. I looked at it, I was just like, he knows something I don't know. And I want to know what it is. Like, I wish I could talk to him in German and find out what it is. And I'm convinced it was because he knows God. He found God. And that's the greatest joke of all. It's the inside joke. You find God, you find happiness. And so he always had a smile on his face. And he evangelized without saying a word. Anxiety, this is another one that Pope Francis talks about ad nauseum. And in this, he counters anxiety with the idea of peace. And not peace in the sense of an absence of violence, but a peace in the sense that we are at peace with ourselves, that there is a lack of turmoil and tension within ourselves. And so when we talk about Christ being the Prince of Peace, yes, there's an aspect of that where he's trying to end war on earth, and that's kind of part of the scripture, but I think at a deeper level, and he says this all the time, peace be with you. Peace be with you. Why? Because we're not talking about you not going off and murdering somebody. We hope that doesn't happen anyways. Peace be with you because you are in turmoil. There's something in you that is battling against yourself. You have anxiety. You're worried about pointless things. There's a whole story of Mary and Martha in the Gospels, and the idea that Martha is out, doing all this crazy stuff, and she's worried about many things. And Mary, what's Mary doing? She sits at the feet of Christ. She sits there because that's where peace resides, and she's fine. She's doing okay. So peace is the example for that. The last thing is loneliness. Billy Joel has the great line in Piano Man, where he says, they're sharing a drink they call loneliness, but it's better than being alone. Go anywhere in Terre Haute. Go to a coffee place, go to a sports program, go wherever. That's our world today. They're sharing a drink they call loneliness, but it's better than drinking alone. They go out into the world, they're with people, but they're lonely. It's an epidemic. Maybe some of you in this room feel this, where you just feel lonely sometimes, even when you're in a crowded room. The response to that is authentic love. And with that love, furthermore, a sense of belonging. It's something that we desperately desire, but the only way that we gain it, ironically, is if we give it. The only way we feel that we belong is if we invite other people into our circle, into our experiences, into our community. Because if you're waiting to get the invitation, it may never come. And if it does, you're always suspicious of why you were invited. But if you're the one inviting, if you're the one going out there and bringing people to Christ, bringing people to the gospel message that Pope Francis is trying to bring forward here, you will never be alone. You will never feel loneliness. I can guarantee it. It's the it's the Cheers theme song. You know, you want to go where everybody knows your name. It's an innate desire within us. We want to be in that place. But the only way we find that sense of belonging and love is if we live it out ourselves. I think that's all I got time for, isn't it?
We can take one question.
Okay, so just a few questions. I should have monitored my time better. I wanted to spend more time on these things, but I think it worked out. Any questions anybody has? Yes.
What would you title that?
Title what?
Like what you just wrote.
This right here? I would title this, so these are the,
Modern deadly sins?
yeah, no, that's pretty good actually. The modern deadly sins. I would agree with that. Those are the modern deadly sins, and these are kind of the modern virtues that go against them. I should have come up with 7 of them. That would have been better, wouldn't it have? That's good. Modern deadly sins. I like that. But they are. And especially nihilism, that is a very modern thing. Like, you don't hear a lot about this in other writings. Like, if you read, like, Aristotle or Plato or even the medieval writers, they don't talk about nihilism. They believed in stuff. Like, they committed themselves to things. They had anxiety. They had loneliness. They had despair. Those are ancient ones that still come up today. But nihilism, that's a big one today. Good question. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay.
I just appreciate what you brought to us twice now, and I think you're connected to us, so I want you to keep that.
Well, thank you.
in your heart.
Yeah, no, it's an honor.
Somehow you're connected to us.
Yeah, no, it's an honor. Well, the one thing I forgot to say is this idea of anxiety and peace, and I just saw it in my notes just now. Another way to describe peace and the peace that Christ gives us is providence. Because that is absolute trust that God has it. God is going to take care of it. And that is peace of mind. When you know that God has got your back. So, yes, there's a connection there. Any other questions? Yes, Josh.
Yeah, can you give us some, like, maybe just like 1 or 2 practical tips that we could be doing in our own lives to strive for the virtues that are out there rather than
Yes, absolutely. So with these, I mean, and Pope Francis, and sadly, I think in the encyclicals, he's more of the big thoughts. So I mean, there's not a whole lot of practical advice in the encyclicals, which, you know, I think that's just kind of the nature of the beast with a lot of that. But I would say, you can go down the list with a lot of these, but the first step, of course, is to have that relationship with Jesus Christ. I mean, it is just essential, and Pope Francis makes it very clear. So you have to pray. And you have to be honest in your prayer. You have to speak to God. You have to speak to him about these things and say, Christ, I'm feeling pretty anxious today. Like, I could use a little peace right now. God, I'm lonely right now. And I don't feel your presence. I don't feel you answering me right now. Can you help me out here? Honesty, not these pious platitudes that we do all the time like that. I mean, that's fine, that's good stuff. But to form that relationship, that's when we get to this level where we have joy and we put a faith in Christ. We have a trust in Christ is in that prayer. Now, when we start with that, and again, if you try and find happiness on its own, you're not going to find it. If you place it in God, if you seek God, you're going to find happiness. That means you got to put the time in. There's I think it was St. Francis de Sales. Is that right? I think it's St. Francis de Sales. He has a great line where he says, you should pray half an hour every day. Unless you're really, really busy, then you should pray for an hour. And the obvious, you need it more. Like when you're busy, when you're stressed out, when things are crazy, that's when you need God all the more. Not to get rid of him and say, I don't have time for God right now. That doesn't work. And if you got that, it goes to the other level. So if you have that connection with God, then suddenly And it is amazing to me when this actually happens. Like when you form that relationship with Christ and you get this, you get joy, right? And all of a sudden you're going to wake up one day and you're just going to feel great. And you're going to be walking up, you're going to be humming and whistling, and people are going to be like, what is wrong with so-and-so? You know, I mean, they're looking, you know, they're feeling pretty good right now. And it's going to be this, you're not even going to realize it's happened. Like that's when you know you've arrived. You'll just stumble on happiness. And it sounds like an infomercial when I say it like that, but it's true. Like if you really invest yourself in that, you're going to find that joy. And it defeats all the other, and you're going to be evangelizing without even knowing it. You're going to be humming down the street and whistling, and people are going to be like, why is he so happy all the time? And then they're going to see you going to church, or they're going to see you make the sign of the cross, or they're going to see you praying a rosary, or whatever it is, and they're going to be like, oh, that's why. That makes sense. So yes, prayer, absolutely the most important. Do I have time for a quick story with that, with prayer? Do I have time for that? Okay, so I don't want to hold anybody. Did David already leave? He warned me he was going to leave. He already left? He left. Quick story. This is a story from Bishop Cousins from Minnesota, and he's a 50-year-old bishop, a newly made bishop just a couple years ago. Very young-looking guy. I mean, he's shorter than I am, and he looks younger than I am, which is saying something because I'm a pretty young-looking guy myself. He was made a bishop, and it was just kind of floored by this. Didn't think he was ever going to be made a bishop. He was made a bishop, and he was told that if you're made a bishop, like you can just go to Rome. And you can just kind of go into the Vatican and just meet the Pope. Like you just have that right to go in there unannounced. Like you don't have to make an appointment. Like if you're a bishop, you can just go. So he happened to be in Rome quickly after he was made a bishop, and he was just like, you know what? Let's just try it out. Let's just see what happens. How far I can get into the Vatican before they stop me because I don't have an appointment, with the Pope. So he comes up, the front doors, the Vatican, and the Swiss Guard, they're there with their halberds and their fancy dress and everything, and he's like, all right, here we go. They're going to spear me, with the halberd. They're going to stop me before I even get in the front door. And instead, they saluted him, because he's in his bishop regalia. He's got his cassock on with all the bishop colors. And they, snap to, and they salute him. And he, oh, that's very nice. And he walks through and going down the corridors and, kind of asked, where the audiences where the Pope were being held. And he was pointing that direction. He got to another corridor, another set of Swiss guards. Same thing, solution, and they let him through. He finally gets to where the Pope actually is. There's a door leading into that entryway, and there's a man, a Monsignor, who has a clipboard, and he's got a pencil, and people are passing through, and he's checking them off. He's just like, oh, here we go. I'm not on the list, like he's got a clipboard. I haven't, made an appointment. Like this is where I'm going to get turned away. And he walks up and he just kind of explains, what he was told, that I'm a bishop, and I've been told I can just go and see the Pope whenever I want, and the man was just like, absolutely, you want to see him right now? Like, I mean, we can let you in. And he was just like, sure, why not? So they wrote him in on the list and checked him off, and he went in, and he got in line, with all these other people who had appointments and were going to see the Pope, kind of these personal invitations. And while he's waiting in line, like he knows, Pope Francis is from Buenos Aires, so he speaks Spanish. And Bishop Cousins is thinking there, okay, how do I introduce myself in Spanish, and he's kind of going through his mind, like, what he's going to say when he gets up to the Pope, and all these things. And he forgot like all the ritual that goes in with this. So usually you meet the Pope, you get down on your knees, and you kiss his ring, like there's a whole procedure, and he's just thinking about the Spanish. So he gets up there, and he doesn't get down on his knees. He doesn't take the Pope's ring or anything. It's kind of this awkward thing, and he just goes, hola, ¿cómo estás? To Pope Francis. And Pope Francis just kind of looks at him, and he was just like, who are you? And he introduced himself, and he says, well, my name is Bishop Cousins. You just recently made me a bishop, and I was told I could come here and see you anytime. And Pope Francis just looks at him, he says, I made you a bishop? He says, you look really, really young, And then at that point, Bishop Cousins in his story, he says he looked up at Pope Francis's face, and you could just see how tired Pope Francis was. Like there was a weariness on his face from just dealing with all of this, the nihilism, despair, anxiety, loneliness of the world, and trying to help it. And there was just a weariness there. And he looked at Bishop Cousins, and he started pointing at his chest, and like hitting him on the chest with his forefinger. And he says, you gotta pray. You gotta pray. You gotta pray. It's cliche. It is. It is very cliche, and you hear from every priest that ever talks. But you gotta pray. You gotta pray. And if you ever for a moment come across a day where you're just in a bad mood and things aren't going your way, reflect on it and think to yourself, did I pray today? And I almost guarantee most likely you didn't, because it makes that big of a difference. So yeah, pray. Awesome.
Thank you, Father Dan, for
Good.
sharing your expertise.